In the summer of 1944, Germany strapped young men to live torpedoes and sent them into the English Channel at 4 knots, the speed of a brisk walk. 80% of them never came back. This was not a suicide weapon, at least not officially. That single word, officially, is doing a lot of heavy lifting, and by the time we're done here, you'll understand exactly why. Picture this: a perspex-dome barely 18 inches above the waterline, the English Channel at night, black and heaving. And on the horizon, the silhouettes of the largest invasion fleet ever assembled, thousands of Allied warships, transports and landing craft, crowding the waters off Normandy. The Allies had just pulled off D-Day, the most ambitious amphibious operation in history, and Germany's once mighty Kriegsmarine had been reduced to this: improvised one-man torpedoes launched from the woods of northern France. For the Reich, the stakes were existential. For the pilots sealed inside those torpedoes, the stakes were simpler: survive the next 2 hours. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a weapon so crude it was aimed using a spike on the nose managed to sink a cruiser, cripple a flotilla, and terrorize the most powerful naval force ever assembled. You'll understand the engineering, the desperation, and the human cost. But before any of that, the Neger's very first mission was a catastrophe so complete that the Allies didn't even notice it happened. That's not a metaphor. They literally had no idea. To understand how Germany ended up betting on a weapon that was barely more than a coffin with a propeller, we need to go back to a navy in ruins, a war being lost, and one engineer's desperate idea. Let me set the stage. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of history's most desperate weapons, hit that like button and subscribe. I've got plenty more where this came from. Now, let me take you back to Germany in 1944, where the Kriegsmarine was running out of options. By early 1944, the German surface fleet was a ghost of itself. The great warships, the pride of the Reich, vessels like Bismarck and Tirpitz, were gone or bottled up in Norwegian fjords, unable to move without being hunted from the sky. The U-boat war in the Atlantic, which had once strangled Britain's supply lines, had turned catastrophic after the spring of 1943. The wolf packs were being found, fixed, and destroyed faster than Germany could replace them. Allied air superiority meant that any large vessel venturing into open water was painting a target on its own hull. Germany still held the French and Italian coastlines, but holding coastline without a functional navy was like owning a harbor with no ships. You could watch the enemy's convoys pass, but you couldn't touch them. The Kriegsmarine was a navy in name only. In the offices and dockyards of what remained of Germany's naval establishment, a different kind of thinking was taking hold. If you can't fight the enemy fleet with battleships and submarines, you bleed it with something smaller, something expendable. The concept was called Kleinkampfverbände, small battle units, and it represented Germany's pivot to asymmetric naval warfare. Explosive motorboats, frogmen, midget submarines, and human torpedoes. The logic was brutally simple: swarm the enemy with cheap expendable weapons and make him pay for every mile of coastline he tried to hold. The philosophical shift was enormous, from fleet-on-fleet engagements to something closer to naval guerrilla tactics. The admirals who had once commanded capital ships were now overseeing workshops that built weapons smaller than a car. Pinprick tactics, they called it. You couldn't sink the Allied fleet, but maybe, just maybe, you could make it bleed. Into this atmosphere of institutional desperation stepped Richard Moore. He was an engineer, not a military strategist, working within the Kriegsmarine's increasingly frantic weapons development programs. Moore's solution was brutal in its simplicity. Take 2 standard G7E electric torpedoes, strap one on top of the other, put a man in the upper one, and point him at the enemy. The upper torpedo would have its warhead removed and replaced with a cockpit. The lower torpedo would remain a live weapon. The weapon's name came from his surname, Moore, meaning Moor in German, and the craft's black paint job made the label stick. The design went from concept to production with alarming speed, a reflection not of engineering confidence, but of how desperate the situation had become. By spring 1944, everyone on both sides of the Channel knew the Allied invasion of France was coming. The question was where and when. Germany's coastal defenses, the vaunted Atlantic Wall, were formidable on paper but stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of coastline. The Navy's role would be to disrupt the invasion fleet. But with what? The surface fleet was gone. The U-boats were being slaughtered. This is where the Neger enters the strategic picture, not as a war-winning weapon, but as a nuisance, a way to make the Allies bleed, even if only a little. The Kriegsmarine's ambition had shrunk from ruling the seas to simply making the enemy pay for crossing the Channel. But ambition means nothing without execution. The Neger existed on paper, an elegant, terrible idea. Now it had to be built, crewed, and launched against the most powerful naval armada in history. And the men who would ride these weapons into battle, they had to be found first. Let's walk through this weapon as if you're standing next to one on a French beach, because the details matter. You're looking at two G7E electric torpedoes, one stacked directly on top of the other, connected by a metal frame. The lower torpedo is the weapon, 300 kilograms of high explosive packed into its warhead, propelled by an electric motor. It's a standard German torpedo in every respect. The upper torpedo is something else entirely. Its warhead has been removed, and the pilot lines up the spike with the target's silhouette, estimates range and angle, and releases the lower torpedo using a cockpit lever. This lever is irreversible. Once pulled, the torpedo drops and runs. If it fails to separate cleanly, the pilot is now riding a live warhead directly into the target. This wasn't a theoretical risk. It happened, repeatedly. And there was nothing the pilot could do about it. The pilot breathes through a Draeger self-contained breathing apparatus that provides 1 to 2 hours of breathable air. After that, he's inhaling whatever leaks through the dome's seals, typically a cocktail of salt spray and battery fumes. The whole craft is painted black for night operations, rendering it nearly invisible on the water's surface after dark. This was not a submarine. It was not a torpedo boat. It was something in between, too slow to flee, too fragile to fight, and too visible to hide in daylight. Now the machine needs men. The pilots were volunteers, and not always experienced submariners. Some came from U-boat crews, but many were drawn from across the Kriegsmarine, young men who stepped forward knowing only the broad outlines of what they were signing up for. The volunteer culture was a mix of patriotic fervor, fatalism, and the particular bravery of men who believe their country's back is against the wall. Post-war historians would compare them to Japanese kamikaze pilots, but the comparison is imperfect. The Neger was not designed as a one-way weapon. There was, in theory, a return trip. The pilots were supposed to release their torpedo and drive home. The problem was that theory and practice were separated by a chasm, but the full dimensions of that chasm belong to later in our story. For now, these men are volunteers, and they believe they're coming back. Approximately 200 Negers were produced in 1944, entering service in March. The units adopted a sawfish emblem as their badge, a predator of the shallows, silent and bladed. By summer, a flotilla of roughly 40 Negers was operational in northern France, concealed in the Favrol woods near Honfleur, hidden beneath the tree canopy from Allied reconnaissance aircraft. The woods sloped down toward the Seine estuary and the English Channel beyond, a short overland transport to launch sites on the beach. And the targets were everywhere. After D-Day, the waters off the Normandy invasion beaches were thick with Allied shipping. Destroyers, minesweepers, transports, even cruisers, anchored or moving slowly in the congested lanes off the beachheads. For a weapon that could only manage 4 knots, stationary or slow-moving targets were essential. The Channel that summer was a target-rich environment like no other. 200 weapons, a few dozen volunteers, a stretch of French coastline, and the largest invasion fleet the world had ever seen just offshore. But before the Neger would face the might of D-Day, it had its first test, and it was a disaster. Anzio, Italy, April 1944. The Allies have been ashore since January, and the beachhead is crowded with shipping, transports, warships, supply vessels clustered in the shallow waters off the Italian coast. It's a target-rich environment for the Neger's combat debut. 30 Negers are prepared for launch on the night of April 20th. The craft are transported overland on trailers, lowered into the Mediterranean surf one by one. Pilots climb in. Perspex domes are sealed. The electric motors hum to life, not a roar, not a growl, but a low, persistent whine that barely registers above the sound of the waves. One by one, the black shapes slide out into the darkness. It should feel like the beginning of something. It is, just not what anyone intended. 13 of the 30 Negers capsize almost immediately upon launching. Nearly half the force is gone before a single craft reaches open water. The Mediterranean chop catches the perspex domes. The positive buoyancy that keeps the craft riding high makes them top-heavy, and one after another they roll and flood. 13 pilots suddenly upside down in dark water, trapped inside steel tubes, fighting to get out. Some manage to escape. Some do not. Imagine volunteering for a secret mission, climbing into a torpedo, and drowning before you've traveled 100 meters from shore. The remaining 17 push out into the darkness toward the Allied anchorage. They navigate by wrist compass, squinting through spray-coated domes, searching for ship-sized silhouettes against the night sky. They find nothing, or if they do, their torpedoes miss or malfunction. Not a single hit is scored. 3 of the 17 fail to return, lost at sea, drowned or captured. The other 14 limp back to shore with nothing to show for the most harrowing night of their lives. And here is the darkest irony. The Allies don't even know it happened. Allied after-action reports from that night record no torpedo attacks, no unusual contacts, no alarms raised. 30 Negers launched, 0 hits, 13 capsized, 3 lost at sea, and the enemy didn't notice. The Neger's combat debut was so catastrophically ineffective that it was invisible. After the Anzio debacle, the Neger program should have been reconsidered. The capsizing rate alone, 43% of the force lost on launch, was damning evidence of a fundamental design flaw. But Germany in 1944 was not in a position to cancel weapons programs, no matter how flawed. On June 6, the Allies landed at Normandy, and within days the Channel was choked with the largest fleet ever assembled, thousands of ships crowding the waters off the invasion beaches. For the Kriegsmarine, this was the moment. Whatever they had, they would throw at the fleet. The Neger flotilla in the Favrol Woods was activated. Roughly 40 craft and their pilots prepared for night attacks against targets that were now plentiful and in many cases nearly stationary. The pilots knew about Anzio. They knew the capsizing problem. Minor modifications had been made, a second aiming spike added near the dome for better targeting, small adjustments to trim. But the fundamental flaws remained. No ability to dive, no armor, limited air, and a torpedo release mechanism that could turn the weapon into a one-way trip. The most dangerous part of the mission wasn't the enemy, it was the weapon itself. Now slow down. It's the evening of July 5, 1944. In the woods near Honfleur, 24 Neger pilots prepare for their mission. The craft are lined up on their trailers beneath the trees. Through gaps in the canopy, the channel is visible, and beyond it, the distant glow of the Allied fleet on the horizon, a constellation of ships' lights and the flicker of anti-aircraft tracers against the darkening sky. The pilots check their Draeger breathing sets, strap on wrist compasses, and review their crude target charts. Climbing into a Neger means folding yourself into a cockpit barely large enough for one man lying in a semi-reclined position. The perspex dome closes overhead, the last barrier between the pilot and the sea. The air immediately feels close, recycled through the breathing apparatus, warm and faintly metallic. The electric motor starts with a low whine, quiet, almost gentle. This is a weapon designed for silence. 24 craft slide into the channel. The water is calmer than it was at Anzio, the channel in July, not the Mediterranean in April. The capsizing problem is reduced but not eliminated. The pilots point their wrist compasses northwest, toward the invasion fleet, and begin their slow crawl across the dark water. At 4 knots, it will take hours to reach the Allied ships, hours alone in a steel tube, breathing canned air, aiming for the silhouettes of warships that could obliterate them in an instant if they're spotted. What those 24 men found waiting for them off the Normandy coast would prove that the Neger, for all its suicidal flaws, could draw blood. But the price of that blood would be almost beyond comprehension. The electric motor hums beneath the pilot's body, a vibration more felt than heard. The perspex-dome is already streaked with salt spray. Visibility is measured in meters, not miles. The channel is black, and the pilot navigates by wrist compass, checking the luminous dial against the spray-blinded dome, fighting to hold a steady heading. The cockpit presses against his shoulders and knees. The recycled air from the Draeger set tastes metallic and warm. Water slaps against the dome, sometimes sheeting over it entirely, a momentary blackout of vision before it drains away, leaving salt residue that further clouds the perspex. The pilot lies semi-reclined, unable to sit up, unable to turn around, unable to do anything except point the craft forward and wait. Time stretches into something elastic. At 4 knots, the crossing takes hours. There is no communication between Negers, no radio, no signal lamps, nothing. Each pilot is alone. The 24 craft that launched together have dispersed into the darkness, each following its own compass bearing, each pilot sealed in his own private world of humming steel and salt water. But here's where it gets insane. The pilot's only way to find his target is to look through the dome, and the dome, riding barely above the waterline, is perpetually awash. He is essentially driving blind through the most heavily defended waters on Earth, surrounded by Allied destroyers, patrol boats and aircraft equipped with radar that could detect a surfaced U-boat at miles. If any of them spot the tiny black shape on the water, a burst of gunfire will end it. The Neger has no armor. A rifle round could pierce the perspex. And yet they press on, mile after slow mile, hour after silent hour. Somewhere ahead, the Allied fleet lies at anchor, hundreds of ships, blacked out but betrayed by the faintest silhouette against the sky. The pilots are looking for shadows. The first indication the Allies have that something is wrong comes not from radar but from the sea itself. In the waters off Sword Beach, the British minesweeper HMS Magic is at anchor. Minesweepers are the workhorses of any invasion fleet, unglamorous vessels that clear the sea lanes for the warships and transports behind them. The crew of the Magic has no reason to expect a torpedo attack. The Luftwaffe is nearly a spent force over the Channel. U-boats have been driven from these coastal waters. The threat, as far as anyone knows, is mines, not men riding torpedoes at walking speed. The torpedo hits the Magic without warning. 300 kilograms of high explosive detonating against a minesweeper's hull is not a fair contest. The explosion tears through the ship's structure. HMS Magic sinks. Somewhere in the dark channel, a Neger pilot has just pulled the release lever and felt the lower torpedo drop away, the sudden lightness as the weapon separates the craft lurching upward with its regained buoyancy. The pilot straining through the salt-crusted dome to see if the torpedo runs true. He can't see the impact, he can only hear it, or perhaps feel the shockwave through the water, a distant concussion transmitted through the steel hull beneath his body. That same night, HMS Cato, another British minesweeper, is struck and sunk. 2 minesweepers gone in a single night, destroyed by a weapon the Allied fleet barely knew existed. The weapon the Allies hadn't known about at Anzio was now impossible to ignore. But the cost of the 24 Negers that launched from the Normandy coast, only 9 return. 15 pilots, more than 60% of the force, are gone, lost at sea, killed by Allied gunfire, drowned when their craft capsized or flooded, or carried into targets by malfunctioning torpedo releases. Some are simply never seen again. The Channel swallowed them whole. What happened next defied all logic. The Neger had just proven it could kill. It had also proven that killing came at a price that would horrify any conventional military planner. 60% casualties in a single mission, and yet within 48 hours, the Kriegsmarine would send them out again. 2 nights later, July 7th, 21 Negers launched from the coast near Honfleur, a smaller force than before because there are fewer pilots and fewer craft left. From a fleet of 200, the numbers were dwindling fast, but the conditions have changed in one critical way: moonlight. The Channel is no longer pitch black. For the Neger pilots, this is a double-edged sword. They can see better. The spray-blinded dome still streams with salt water, but the moonlight illuminates the shapes of Allied ships with ghostly clarity. Squinting through the graduated scale, a pilot can actually line up a shot, but moonlight also means they can be seen. Allied patrol aircraft spot them first. The small black shapes on the silver water are unmistakable once you know what to look for, and after the attacks 2 nights ago, the Allies now know exactly what to look for. Searchlights sweep the water in brilliant white arcs. Gunfire erupts from multiple directions. Destroyers turn toward the contacts, their bows cutting white wakes across the moonlit channel. For a craft that moves at 4 knots and cannot dive, there is no escape. And yet, through the chaos, some Negers reach their targets. One of them finds the ORP Dragon, a Polish crewed light cruiser serving with the Allied fleet. The Dragon is a substantial warship, not a minesweeper. A Neger pilot lines up the nose spike with the cruiser's silhouette against the moonlit sky and pulls the lever that could not be undone. The torpedo strikes the Dragon amidships. The warhead does catastrophic damage. The cruiser does not sink immediately. She is towed to shallow water, but the damage is beyond any hope of repair. ORP Dragon, a warship that had served Poland and then the Allies since 1939, will be scuttled deliberately, sunk as a breakwater for the artificial Mulberry Harbour off the invasion beaches. A warship reduced to rubble. That same night, another Neger finds HMS Pylades, a third British minesweeper. Pylades is sunk. The minesweeper fleet, the unglamorous backbone of the entire invasion, is proving terrifyingly vulnerable to this crude weapon. This is where the story takes a dark turn. The 21 pilots who launched on July 7th face the full fury of an alerted fleet. Aircraft strafe the surface, their tracers stitching across the moonlit water. Depth charges, weapons normally reserved for hunting submarines deep beneath the waves, are dropped near the tiny craft, and even near misses are lethal to a vessel with no armor and no ability to submerge. The concussive force alone can kill the pilot or crack the perspex-dome, flooding the cockpit in seconds. And those pilots whose torpedo releases jam find themselves in the most nightmarish scenario imaginable. They cannot stop. They cannot turn away fast enough. The weapon will not let go. The Neger, with its live warhead still attached, carries its own operator into the side of an Allied ship. Not by design, not by choice. By malfunction, the line between weapon and operator disappears entirely. In 2 nights of attacks, the Neger has achieved what no other German naval weapon could in the summer of 1944. It has put warships on the bottom of the English Channel. A cruiser crippled beyond repair, 3 minesweepers sunk, at least 1 destroyer credited to Niger attacks across the broader campaign. The weapon that capsized on its first mission, the weapon the Allies hadn't even noticed at Anzio, has now forced the most powerful fleet in history to change its defensive procedures. Allied commanders order increased nighttime patrols, searchlight sweeps, and standing anti-torpedo watches on all vessels in the invasion anchorage. Resources that could be supporting the ground campaign ashore in Normandy are diverted to hunting these tiny, near-invisible craft. The pinprick strategy is working, not by destroying the fleet, but by bleeding it, harassing it, forcing it to look over its shoulder at every shadow on the water. But the toll on the Neger crews is almost beyond calculation. The men who return from these missions are shattered, physically cramped and salt-blinded, psychologically wrung out from hours alone in a coffin-sized cockpit, navigating through gunfire and depth charges, with nothing but a wrist compass and a plastic dome between them and the sea. Many who technically return wash ashore days later in their Negers, dead from carbon dioxide poisoning, hypothermia, or slow flooding. The craft's positive buoyancy kept them afloat. The sealed dome kept the pilot entombed. The craft that come back empty are worse. They tell no story at all. And still there were men who volunteered to go again. These volunteers, men who had chosen this, represent something that defies easy categorization. Not kamikaze, not conventional sailors. Something in between, riding the line between duty and self-destruction in a weapon that made no promises about bringing them home. By August, the Normandy campaign is turning decisively against Germany. The Allied breakout from the beachheads, Operation Cobra, has shattered the German defensive line, and the Wehrmacht is in full retreat across France. The Favrol Wood staging area near Honfleur is no longer safe. Allied forces are advancing inland, and the coastal positions that sheltered the Neger flotillas are being overrun or threatened. On the night of August 16th, the last Neger attack is launched. Details of this final sortie are sparse. The records are fragmentary, the surviving pilots few. What is known is that the results were negligible. The element of surprise, already compromised after July, is completely gone. The Allies are watching for them, hunting them with aircraft and patrol boats before they can get anywhere near the fleet. The age of the Neger ends not with a climactic battle, but with a slow fade. Craft lost, pilots killed or captured, staging areas abandoned as the front collapses around them. The weapon that was born from desperation dies from the same cause. Germany's retreat across France leaves the Negers without bases, without targets within range, and without any strategic purpose. Some craft are captured intact by advancing Allied forces. British and American intelligence officers examine them with a mixture of professional curiosity and something close to horror. The cramped cockpits, the crude aiming spikes, the irreversible levers, the breathing apparatus rated for 2 hours, every detail tells the story of a weapon designed with the operator's survival as an afterthought. In the span of 4 months, the Neger had gone from blueprint to battlefield to museum piece. When the final accounting was done, the numbers told a story that was as damning as it was extraordinary. Of 158 Negers deployed operationally between April and August 1944, 106 were lost. That is a 67% loss rate on deployed units, and the actual fatality rate among the pilots was even higher, the 80% that never came home. 4 out of every 5 men who climbed into a Neger did not return. Now lay out the full balance sheet. What did those 106 lost Negers and the men inside them actually achieve? The crippling and scuttling of one cruiser, Orp Dragon, now a breakwater, not a warship. 1 destroyer sunk. 3 minesweepers, HMS Magic, HMS Cato, HMS Pylades, all sent to the bottom of the English Channel. In total, 5 Allied warships sunk or destroyed, against 106 Negers lost. Put this in perspective. The D-Day invasion fleet comprised over 6,000 vessels, 5 ships, none of them capital ships, none of them irreplaceable, against the near-total destruction of the Neger force. By any conventional military calculus, this is a catastrophic exchange rate. Roughly 21 Negers lost for every Allied ship destroyed. Each kill cost approximately 17 pilots' lives. And yet, the strategic disruption was real. The Neger attacks forced the Allies to divert patrol craft, aircraft, and standing watches to counter a threat that was, by tonnage, negligible. Resources that could have supported the ground campaign were tied down hunting craft that weighed less than 3 tons apiece. The pinprick had drawn blood. but the price was measured in human lives at a rate that staggers the imagination. Transition from statistics to the men behind them. Because numbers are clean, numbers are abstract. The reality was not. Some Negers washed ashore days after missions with their pilots still inside, dead from carbon dioxide poisoning or hypothermia. The craft's buoyancy had kept them floating. The sealed domes had kept the pilots entombed. Allied soldiers walking the beaches would find these black shapes rolling in the surf and have to open the perspex to discover the body. These men had technically returned. Their weapons had simply outlasted them. Dozens of Neger pilots were captured by the Allies, pulled from the water after their craft was shot up or swamped. British and American interrogators were often stunned by the youth of the prisoners and the crudeness of their weapon. These were not elite submariners. They were young men, some barely trained, who had volunteered for missions with survival odds worse than a coin flip. The interrogators would write their reports with the clinical detachment of professionals, but the reports betray between the lines a disbelief that borders on pity. And then there were the ones who simply vanished. No wreckage found, no body recovered. The channel swallowed them, craft and crew, without a trace. For their families in Germany, there would be a notice: missing in action, no grave, no explanation. The Kleinkampfverbände were secretive units. The missions were classified. The losses were absorbed into the larger hemorrhage of the German military in 1944. One more line in an ever-growing ledger of the dead. A father, a son, a brother, somewhere beneath the grey water of the English Channel, and no one could say where. The Neger's existence was not widely known during the war, or even after it for many years. The Allies treated captured specimens as intelligence curiosities, studying the design, cataloguing the components, and classifying the details. German propaganda made little of the weapon. It was difficult to celebrate a system with a fatality rate that would have been unacceptable in any military on Earth, even one accustomed to heavy losses by 1944. The Neger existed in a strange twilight, too deadly to ignore, too costly to celebrate, and too small to change the course of anything. The Neger was retired. Its successor, the Marder, a submersible version that could at least dive beneath the surface and give the pilot a chance of evading detection, would carry on the concept in slightly less suicidal form. But the age of the human torpedo in its most brutal and primitive incarnation was over. And yet, the story doesn't end there. The Marder addressed the most lethal flaw by allowing the craft to submerge, but the concept of the human torpedo was inherently limited. By 1945, Germany's naval war was over in all but name. The Kleinkampfverbände continued small-scale operations until the final weeks, throwing whatever they had left into the path of the advancing Allies. But the Neger's brief window of operational relevance, those 4 months from April to August 1944, was never repeated. There would be no second act. The Allies, for their part, adapted quickly and moved on. The Neger attacks, while shocking in the moment, were a footnote in the vast Normandy campaign. The 5 ships lost were replaced without strain. The defensive measures put in place against human torpedoes became standard procedure and then, gradually, unnecessary as the threat evaporated. The weapon that bore Moore's name had achieved tactical surprise exactly once, and in war, once is rarely enough. The Neger occupies a strange and uncomfortable place in the mythology of the Second World War. It is neither celebrated nor widely remembered. In Germany, the modern Navy's mine warfare units still wear the sawfish emblem, a quiet, almost hidden nod to the Kleinkampfverbände and the men who rode torpedoes into the Channel 70 years ago. Most sailors who wear the badge today couldn't tell you its full history. At the Technic Museum in Speyer, a Marder sits on display, not a Neger, but close enough to evoke the same claustrophobic dread. Visitors peer through the perspex-domed and try to imagine folding themselves inside. Most of them step back. The comparison to kamikaze pilots persists in every history book that mentions the weapon, but it remains imperfect, and the imperfection matters. The Japanese designed their weapons, the Oka, the Shinio boats, for one-way trips. The intent was death. The Germans did not. The Neger was supposed to bring its pilot home. The distinction matters not because it changes the outcome. The fatality rates were comparable, and in some cases the Negers were worse, but because it reveals something about the nature of the weapon itself. The Neger killed its operators not by design, but by negligence, by the accumulation of flaws, the capsizing, the flooding, the jammed release levers, the 2-hour air supply, the inability to dive, that made survival a matter of luck rather than skill or engineering. It was a weapon that didn't intend to be suicidal. It just was. 80%. That was the number 4 out of 5 men who climbed into a Neger, who sealed themselves inside a perspex-domed barely above the English Channel, who navigated by wrist compass toward the silhouettes of warships, who aimed using a metal spike on the nose of a torpedo, never came home. The Neger was not Germany's most destructive weapon. It was not its most sophisticated. It was, perhaps, its most desperate, a weapon that asked everything of its operators and gave almost nothing in return. 5 ships sunk, 106 craft lost, a weapon that existed for 4 months and left behind almost nothing except a sawfish badge, and a question that has no comfortable answer: what kind of war asks men to ride a torpedo? If this story gripped you, subscribe for more untold history from the battles that shaped the world. The channel kept most of them. It keeps them still.